Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, December 2nd, 2024. All right, so the big news from the weekend was all this fighting that's happening in Syria, this HTS offensive on Aleppo. We're going to get into that, but I wanted to start with some stuff about Gaza. I feel like Gaza is getting overlooked even more now than it was before. So the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, former defense minister says Israel is conducting ethnic cleansing. So a former Israeli defense minister has said Israel is conducting an ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza, where Israeli troops are forcibly expelling civilians under the threat of death. So this is Moshe Yaalon, a former member of the ruling Likud party. He was a defense minister under Netanyahu from 2013 to 2016. That means he was a defense minister during the 2014 Gaza war, which was a very brutal conflict, killed over 2,000 Palestinians, including many children, many civilians. So this guy is no dove. He's considered a hawk. He's considered right-wing in Israeli politics. And he comes out and says, this is ethnic cleansing. And he made these comments first on Saturday while criticizing the current Netanyahu government. Apparently, he's been a critic of Netanyahu for a while since he left Netanyahu's last government. So Yaalon said, quote, "The path they're dragging us down is to occupy, annex, and ethnically cleanse. Look at the northern strip," end quote. So he was asked to clarify if he meant that Israel is currently conducting ethnic cleansing or is headed in that direction. And Yaalon pointed to what is happening on the ground in northern Gaza today. He said, quote, "There's no Beit Lahia, there's no Beit Hanun. They're now operating in Jabalia. They're basically cleaning the territory of Arabs," end quote. So these are the cities, I've been talking about this a lot lately. The northern cities of Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and Jabalia have been under a total siege since early October as part of this ethnic cleansing campaign that is following this general's plan, as they call it, which basically called for a complete evacuation of northern Gaza. Anyone who stays behind, kill them, either by starving them or shooting or bombing them. So in those areas, those three cities, Israeli troops have been demolishing homes, demolishing basically every building in sight, so the Palestinian civilians have nowhere to return. So this is what he's talking about. And his comments sparked a very strong backlash in Israel, but he doubled down on Sunday. He did another interview, and he was asked, is the term ethnic cleansing accurate? And he said that it was, and that there was no other word for what is happening. And again, you can call what's happening in Gaza genocide, ethnic cleansing, kind of overall, but he's specifically talking about what's happening in northern Gaza, where they are carrying out this plan of moving all the civilians out of there under the threat of death, killing many of them in the process. And as they move out, they destroy their homes so they can't go back, and they shoot anybody who tries to return. There's no other word for what that is than ethnic cleansing. And even the general's plan calls it cleansing. So there's just no way around this. And it just really is amazing. I mean, I talk about it all the time, but when it comes to American media, the big papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they've barely covered this at all. And they haven't called it ethnic cleansing or anything like that. We've seen editorials from Haaretz calling it ethnic cleansing, but it's just barely getting any attention in the U.S. And this is a U.S.-funded ethnic cleansing campaign. Israel's doing this with U.S. weapons. And so Yaalon pointed to Israeli ministers who openly call for the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza and the establishment of Jewish settlements. Just recently, Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, and he's a minister in charge of West Bank settlements as well. He said that it may be possible to cut the population of Gaza in half within 2 years. And, he calls it voluntary immigration, but there's nothing voluntary about the displacement that's happening in Gaza today. All right, so the next one here, nearly 100 killed by Israeli attacks in Gaza over 24 hours. So Gaza's civil defense said Sunday that Israeli attacks killed nearly 100 over the previous 24 hours as Israeli strikes continue to hit targets across the Strip. The civil defense agency said, quote, nearly 100 martyrs were killed in the Gaza Strip within 24 hours as a result of the continuous Israeli bombing operations on homes and citizens' gatherings, end quote. So Gaza's health ministry put out a lower death toll in their daily update. They said that 47 were killed in the previous 24 hours. As I always mention, the health ministry counts by the number of bodies that make it to hospitals. And they're saying, many are still missing under the rubble. And the civil defense says they have not been able to work in northern Gaza. So that means many of the bodies, many of the people that are killed are not being brought to the hospitals. The civil defense said, quote, until this moment, civil defense crews are prevented from exercising their duties in northern Gaza, and this has led to hundreds of citizens remaining under the rubble, end quote. The civil defense statement said the most deaths occurred in an Israeli strike on a house sheltering displaced Palestinians in Jabalia, northern Gaza. That was on Saturday, and more than 40 Palestinians were killed in that attack. So also on Saturday, an Israeli strike on a vehicle in the southern city of Khan Yunis killed 5 people, including 3 aid workers with the U.S.-based World Central Kitchen. Israel claimed without evidence that one of the aid workers was a terrorist. Again, just no evidence at all. They kill aid workers, call them terrorists. This is the Israeli MO. They've killed a lot of aid workers. And if you remember earlier this year when they killed, I think it was 7 World Central Kitchen workers, and most of them were foreigners, including an American, I believe 3 people from the UK, maybe an Australian too. That caused a big uproar because there were foreign aid workers. But, this has barely been a blip on the radar here, them killing more World Central Kitchen workers. And the World Central Kitchen said that they were suspending operations in Gaza in response. So the starvation, the lack of aid is still as bad as it has been since October 2023. The aid is just not improving. And again, a big part of the ethnic cleansing campaign in the north is starving people out. All right, so the next one here, to get into some of the serious stuff, I'm going to go out of order here. I'm going to start with the article that Jason wrote this. Jason Ditz wrote this on Saturday about HTS. So HTS is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And they are the dominant force in Idlib, the northwestern Syrian province of Idlib, which they've had control of for many years at this point. And HTS is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. Its leader, al-Julani, was essentially the founder of al-Qaeda in Syria, which was known as al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front. And he was buddies with al-Baghdadi and ISIS, and then al-Qaeda and ISIS had a split, and they ended up fighting. I think that was in 2013. Then a few years later, in 2016, al-Nusra rebranded, I believe it was Jabhat. I forget the name of this group, but then after that, they became HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which brought in some other Islamist groups. And he denounced, al-Julani denounced al-Qaeda and ISIS, and he fought against them. And Haras al-Din is like the al-Qaeda group now. They're also in Idlib, and they fight each other sometimes. So HTS and al-Julani essentially went on this kind of rebranding campaign because they wanted to be, as Jason puts it in his article, they wanted to be a more palatable option for the West, for the U.S., because they wanted support from the West. They wanted to maintain control of Idlib and expand out. So But they are, it's the again, al-Jilani is the leader of Al-Qaeda. HTS is considered a terrorist organization by the U.S. And HTS is backed by Turkey. We'll get into that in the next story. This is really just about the fighting. So they've taken over most of Aleppo, which is a big deal. I mean, Aleppo is the second biggest city in Syria. And again, these are Al-Qaeda type guys that are taking over. There's a lot of Syrian Christians and other minorities in Aleppo, and a lot of people have fled or are very worried about what these guys are going to do. I saw one video of them who, which I believe was confirmed, because another thing with Syria, when things ramp up in Syria, the propaganda is really out of control. It's tough to know what is what. I saw all these claims that Assad was overthrown, that there was a coup in Damascus, which that was just complete nonsense. Then I saw all these other claims that al-Jilani, the leader of HTS, was killed, but it was a picture of someone who was killed years ago in Syria. It's pretty tough. Like, the information war when it comes to Syria is pretty serious. But anyway, I was going to say I saw a picture or a video of an HTS fighter knocking down a Christmas tree in Aleppo. So the minorities, the Christians and things are worried for good reason there. So the reports are, that there's hundreds dead, hundreds of HTS and hundreds of Syrian army members and Syrian allies dead. A few dozen civilians have been killed. So it's a mess. I mean, this is a big, serious offensive. And, you talk about the timing of this. This happened after Israel really ramped up its strikes in Syria, right at the end of that Lebanon, when the Lebanon ceasefire started. Ceasefire in quotes, because Israel has been striking Lebanon. But they bombed all the border crossings between Syria and Lebanon. So this is, again, it's pretty big here. Trying to think what other points here, just from the fighting over the weekend. Also, they're fighting in, so another aspect, the Kurdish YPG, or the SDF, this is the U.S.-backed Kurds in eastern Syria. Some of them have actually gone over to Aleppo in the northwest to fight against HTS. And then there's also another group, the Syrian National Army, which is made up of these Turkish factions, these Turkish-backed factions. I think they're on an offensive in some of the Kurdish-controlled areas. And HTS, I mean, it's just such a mess. They're leading this offensive, but there's all other different little groups under their umbrella, these other jihadist groups. I know there's Uyghurs that are fighting. Again, it's just such a mess. And the next one here, so Turkey is very involved in this. Turkish intelligence directing HTS offensive in Syria. So this article's from The Cradle. It's based on a report from AFP, the French news agency, and that report said that militants from the Al-Qaeda affiliated Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, currently invading Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. That's probably where I thought of that from. They're taking orders from Turkish intelligence, and this was reported by AFP. So HTS took over numerous villages in the Aleppo countryside before taking control of large parts of Aleppo city on Saturday, including the ancient citadel. AFP writes that opposition sources in touch with Turkish intelligence said that Turkey had given a green light to the offensive. An AFP correspondent in HTS-held Idlib further reported that, quote, the jihadists and their Turkey-backed allies took orders from a joint operations command, end quote. So it's not clear exactly what that joint operations command is referring to. The Cradle notes that during the U.S.-backed covert war on Syria that began in 2011, the CIA and allied intelligence agencies established joint operations rooms in southern Turkey and Amman and Jordan, and in Amman, Jordan, to direct the activities of their extremist proxies fighting the Syrian government. There is a report from a Russian newspaper that said the current HTS attack was coordinated between Turkish, Ukrainian, and French intelligence with Israeli support and U.S. approval. So we don't know, exactly. We know Turkey's definitely involved. They've always backed these groups. The U.S., there's a guy named James Jeffrey who served as an envoy to Syria under Obama, under Trump. When Jolani did this little rehabilitation interview with PBS Frontline, they put him in a suit, and he was saying things like how he didn't want to fight the West or whatever. James Jeffrey said that HTS was an asset for the U.S. in Idlib, that they were the least bad option. So the U.S., I'm sure, backs them in some covert way, basically, and really tacitly backs them, because Turkey, as much of a mess as it is that the U.S. backs the Kurds against Turkey, the U.S. is still kind of on Turkey's side against the Syrian government. So I guess it's just such a mess. And then there's also some interesting things in here about the Israeli reaction. Netanyahu held a special security discussion on Friday evening with the heads of the defense establishment to discuss the fighting in Syria. According to Hebrew media, Israeli officials view the Turkish-backed extremist advance on Aleppo as an opportunity to weaken Syria, which is a key ally of Hezbollah and Iran in the axis of resistance. An unnamed Israeli official told the Hebrew newspaper that the fighting, quote, is something we need to closely monitor and see how it develops. It doesn't necessarily affect us, especially not in the short term, but any erosion of stability in a neighboring country could also impact us. It seems here that there are also opportunities for change, end quote. So certainly Israel, the U.S. have an interest in this going down. And, there's certainly... it's possible that the U.S. could have given Turkey the green light on this. Again, we don't know anything like that, but I wouldn't rule it out, considering the U.S.'s history in Syria and support for these types of groups. So definitely another story I didn't get to. Scott sent it to me earlier, Scott Horton. There's a story in the Kiev Post, the Ukrainian paper, that says these HTS guys have been, or some of them have been trained by Ukrainian intelligence. And there's reports that they're using Ukrainian drones. I mean, that's really something. We know that some of these guys have gone over to Ukraine to fight. So anyway, so the next one here, to get into some Ukraine stuff. Zelensky says that, and sorry, just going back to that Ukraine thing, I'll write something on that tomorrow. I wanted to kind of dig into more of the Ukraine connections to HTS before I just wrote up something quick. But anyway, the next one here, Zelensky says he would cede territory for NATO protection. So on Friday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he was willing to temporarily cede territory to Russia to bring an end to the war in exchange for NATO protection over Ukraine. Zelensky told Sky News, quote, "If we want to stop the hot stage of the war, we should take under the NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control. That's what we need to do fast, and then Ukraine can get back the other parts of its territory diplomatically," end quote. So, this was reported by a lot of outlets as Zelensky saying for the first time that he's willing to cede territory to Russia for peace talks. And these comments are a shift in his position, but this isn't something Russia would ever accept. Is, essentially what he's saying is they would freeze the lines, agree to a ceasefire, and then all the territory that Ukraine controls would come under NATO protection, and that he would get the other territory back through a diplomatic deal. I mean, it's just not a realistic thing that he's saying here. But again, it is a little different than his long-stated demands, his long-stated goal of driving Russia out of all the territory it controls, driving it out of Crimea before peace talks can even happen, which, of course, is just not realistic. And then what has Putin been saying lately? Putin says he's open for talks, but he's pointing back. He spoke with Olaf Scholz recently, the German leader, and pointed to conditions that he laid out earlier this year when he gave a speech in June. He was saying that his conditions for peace were a Ukrainian withdrawal from the territories, from the oblasts that Russia has annexed in Ukraine. He wants Ukrainian neutrality and the lifting of all Western sanctions on Russia. And of course, neutrality has always been Russia's biggest demand. So this idea of ceding territory for NATO membership Russia's not going to go for that. When they have the advantage on the battlefield, they have time on their side, they have the manpower advantage. All right, so the next one here, Boris Johnson says we're fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. So former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson acknowledged in an interview last week that the West is waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine and argued NATO has not done enough to achieve victory. Johnson said, quote, we're waging a proxy war, but we're not giving our proxies the ability to do the job. For years now, we've been allowing them to fight with one hand tied behind their backs, and it has been cruel, end quote. So I, like many others, have long referred to the Ukraine war as a proxy war, as a U.S.-NATO proxy war against Russia. A lot of people disagree with that label, but here is Boris Johnson, one of the biggest champions of the proxy war, calling it a proxy war. And he played a very key role in sabotaging peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in the early days of the conflict to ensure the war would continue. This is kind of an infamous story at this point, but it's worth kind of going over again. In April 2022, Boris Johnson, when he was the Prime Minister of the UK, went over to Ukraine and told Zelensky not to negotiate and said that even if Ukraine was ready to sign a deal with Russia, its Western backers were not. And Ukrainska Pravda was the first outlet to report this meeting and said that his message to Zelensky was the position of the collective West. And over a year later, David Arakhamia, a Ukrainian official who actually led the negotiations with Russia, confirmed that Johnson, I'll read his quote. He said, quote, Johnson came to Kiev and said that we would not sign anything with the Russians at all, and let's just fight, end quote. So this is who Boris Johnson is, proudly calling the conflict a proxy war. And he was also saying that the UK and other Western troops should defend Ukrainian territory as part of any future ceasefire deal, saying that they need Western peacekeepers in Ukraine. Another thing, of course, that Russia is not going to go for. All right, so the next one here, as many as 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have deserted. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So Ukrainian soldiers refusing to report for duty or walking away from their frontline positions are becoming an increasing problem for Kiev. One Ukrainian lawmaker said that there have been as many as 200,000 desertions. Ukrainian officials and soldiers told AP that facing every imaginable shortage, tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops, tired and bereft, have walked away from combat and frontline positions to slide into their anonymity. Entire units have abandoned their posts, leaving defensive lines vulnerable and accelerating territorial losses, according to military commanders and soldiers. So, of course, this is something that's increased as the wars dragged on. In 2022, 9,000 Ukrainians were prosecuted for desertion. That number increased to 24,000 in 2023. And it skyrocketed to 50,000 during the first 9 months of 2024. And the prosecutions don't capture the whole picture because not everybody is caught and prosecuted. And one Ukrainian lawmaker said that the number could be as high as 200,000. All right, so the next one here, Israel steps up attacks across southern Lebanon. So this one is from Jason Ditz. Media reports are adhering to the idea that the Lebanon ceasefire continues to hold. However, there is an awful lot of firing in southern Lebanon for that to actually be true. Israel began carrying out attacks on Thursday, and those attacks have escalated significantly over the weekend. Israel's first airstrikes were against the tiny border town of Rab el Thalalthan in Lebanon's Marja Yun district. The attack killed at least 2 people and wounded 2 others, and these were the first confirmed fatalities since the ceasefire took effect Wednesday. So they killed 2 people. They also launched an attack against a car in Tyre that injured 3 people, including a 7-year-old child. Another attack near Sedan wounded another, and Israeli drones were flying over Beirut. There's been no Israeli attacks on Beirut yet since the ceasefire went into effect. I call it a ceasefire. And it is amazing. I mean, the headlines that you see from like the New York Times say, oh, Lebanon ceasefire holds despite Israeli airstrikes. Like, it's just a ceasefire to them means Israel can fire and Hezbollah doesn't fire back. So there's been no sign of Hezbollah firing back. Israel is accusing Hezbollah of violating the ceasefire, but they haven't fired. And if, under the ceasefire deal, both sides have 60 days to get out of southern Lebanon. So if their claims of Hezbollah violating is just Hezbollah activity in southern Lebanon, if they're not supposed to be out of there yet, then they can't call that a violation of the ceasefire. But of course, as we know, the U.S. gave Israel a guarantee that they could strike South Lebanon, basically, if they choose to. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. backs protesters in Georgia and slams the government. So the U.S. has strongly condemned Georgia's decision to postpone talks on joining the European Union and is backing anti-government protesters in the country. Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze announced he would push back talks with the EU on Thursday after the European Parliament claimed the recent parliamentary election in Georgia, which saw the ruling Georgian Dream Party win 54% of the vote, was neither free nor fair. So that was the accusation from the EU. The U.S. jumped on those accusations as well. Haven't seen them put forward any evidence of these irregular, of why this election was not free or fair. I'm talking about the U.S. and the EU here. So what's weird about this, so they make this huge deal about what the prime minister did in response to the EU criticizing their elections. But just last week, the EU said that it had halted Georgia's accession talks, accusing the country of going backwards. So basically saying they halted Georgia's talks on the EU future membership. So the prime minister comes out and says, so he said that he's going to halt the talks on joining the EU, and he will not accept any grants from the EU until 2028. And he said by that time, Georgia would be prepared economically to open negotiations to become an EU member by 2030. But in response to what he did, the U.S. and the EU are really coming out strongly against the government. And at the same time, the Georgian president, who's pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-U.S., she's trying to overturn the results of the elections. So this is, it looks like the U.S. and the EU are trying to back some sort of potential coup here. So in response to this decision by Georgia, U.S. Ambassador to Georgia Robin L. Dunnigan said that the Georgian government's decision was, quote, latest in a series of actions that again calls into question this government's commitment to a Western path, end quote. You see a picture here of protesters firing fireworks. This was Sunday night or early Monday morning in Tbilisi in the capital. The State Department announced that it was suspending a strategic partnership that it had with Georgia in response to this move. The prime minister downplayed what the U.S. did, saying that Georgia will deal with the incoming Trump administration. So, again, to get into the president, so amid these protests, you have Georgia's president Salome Zurabishvili. She is saying that she will refuse to step down when her term ends at the end of the month, calling the recent parliamentary elections illegitimate. Zurabishvili, she was born in France, and she actually once served as the French ambassador to Georgia, and then she became Georgia's foreign minister after that somehow, and then she was elected president. I forget which year exactly, but I mean, this is, she came from France. So it's no surprise that she's pro-West. But so she's saying, that the election should be basically overturned, that there should be new elections. She's calling for the protesters to put pressure on Georgia's constitutional court. EU leaders just spoke with her on Sunday. So the EU is essentially on the same page as the one who's calling, again, for the election to be declared rigged. So this is definitely an area to keep an eye on. And of course, I didn't get into this in this story. Maybe this week I'll do some more digging into this. But you have these NGOs that are funded by the U.S. through the National Endowment for Democracy and things like that that are involved in these protests and everything. But again, just definitely a place to keep an eye on here. All right, so the next story, the last one, the U.S. approves a new arms sale for Taiwan. So the U.S. approved a new arms sale for Taiwan on Friday, a day before Taiwanese President William Lai Ching-te arrived in Hawaii for a 2-day visit as part of a tour of the region. The Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency said the Biden administration approved 2 potential arms deals for Taiwan. One is for spare parts and support for the island's fleets of U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets. That's worth $320 million. The other sale is for supporting and maintaining a military communication system known as the Improved Mobile Subscriber Equipment, which is worth $65 million. So this approval comes as China has been stepping up its warnings to the U.S. that Taiwan is a major red line. Of course, in response, the Chinese Foreign Ministry was not happy about these new sales and saying that they will take resolute and strong measures to defend our nation's sovereignty, saying they'll take countermeasures. And China also is unhappy with President Lai's visit to Hawaii. He was in Hawaii over the weekend as part of this little tour of the Pacific that he's doing. He's visiting Pacific Island nations, which, unlike the U.S., actually have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And he fit in a trip to Hawaii in there, so China's not happy about that. And he's also going to stop in Guam, which is a U.S. territory. And, this goes to show, as we've been covering, the U.S. is, China has been really insisting that the U.S. has to change course on Taiwan. And the U.S. is just ignoring those concerns, ignoring all these warnings that China's putting out there. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from James Carden, Russia's red lines, the U.S. is playing with fire in Ukraine. One from Daniel Larison, Trump's senseless economic wars. One written by an anonymous IDF reservist, my impressions as an Israeli reservist in Gaza, that was published in Haaretz. One from Ted Snyder, the cynical selling of the war in Ukraine. One from Arij Hijazi, my stories as an OBGYN in Gaza reveal the truth of the Gaza genocide. So please go check all of that out. Lots of stuff in our blog, lots of stories in the lower parts of the page here. A lot of stuff happened over the weekend. I hope I'm covering enough stuff here. It's just been so much happening in so many different places now. So that is it. You can support this show by liking, subscribing, commenting, telling your friends about this show, telling them about antiwar.com. Follow us on X, on Instagram. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.